My name is David, and for the last 10 years, the rhythm of my life was dictated by the soft chime of a pill timer and the shallow breaths of my mother, Eleanor, sleeping in the room next to mine. It was a life I had chosen, or perhaps a life that had chosen me when I packed up my apartment in the city and moved back into the pale yellow house of my childhood. I had traded a budding career in architecture for the sacred, suffocating duty of a full-time caregiver. The world outside shrank to the dimensions of our small suburban lot, its seasons marked not by holidays, but by the progression of Mom's illness, a relentless tide pulling her further away from the woman she used to be. The silence in that house was a living thing, thick with unspoken words and the ghosts of healthier years. My sister, Chloe, 2 states and a universe away, was a voice on the phone, a collection of breezy excuses wrapped in cellophane-thin apologies. Her visits were rare, strategic incursions, always brief and perfectly timed to coincide with a holiday where other family might bear witness to her fleeting devotion. Dee sweep in with expensive, impractical gifts, cashmere throws for a woman who could no longer feel the cold, artisanal chocolates for a woman who could barely swallow. She never offered to help with the bathing, the feeding, or the endless, draining vigilance. She would sit by Mom's bedside, hold her hand for a carefully curated hour, and whisper things I couldn't hear, her voice a low, sweet murmur that always left a bitter residue in the air long after her rental car had sped away. I convinced myself it didn't matter. I was doing this for Mom, not for recognition. My reward was in the small moments, a flicker of recognition in her tired eyes, a faint squeeze of my hand. I was the keeper of her dignity, the steward of her final chapter, and I believed with a foolish, filial piety that such a sacrifice would be understood, that it would be honored. I was wrong. The day of the will reading felt like a betrayal in slow motion. The lawyer's office was sterile and impersonal, all polished mahogany and the scent of old paper. Chloe sat beside me, dabbing at her eyes with a pristine tissue, a portrait of performative grief. I felt numb, suspended in the strange quiet that follows a death. Then the lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, cleared his throat and began to read. The legal jargon washed over me until a single, brutal phrase cut through the fog. To my daughter, Chloe, I bequeath my property at 142 Oak Street and the entirety of my remaining estate. The words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Chloe gasped, a small, theatrical sound of surprise she had almost certainly practiced. I felt the blood drain from my face. To me, David, her son, her keeper, her constant companion through the long, dark night of her illness, she had left a token sum, just enough to feel like an insult, and a coldly worded instruction to vacate the property within 30 days. The will's justification was a knife twist. As David is single and has fewer responsibilities, this arrangement will allow Chloe and her family the stability they require. I looked at my sister, and the mask of sorrow had slipped, revealing a glint of smug triumph in her eyes. The whispers I had overheard during her last few visits suddenly coalesced into a devastating certainty. She had poisoned our mother's mind against me, painting my sacrifice as failure, my single status as a sign of fecklessness. While I was changing bedpans, she was changing the will. As we left the office, Chloe was already on her phone, her voice bright and energized. "Mark, you won't believe it." "Yes, the whole thing. I'm thinking a full gut renovation. Open concept kitchen, maybe knock out that back wall for a patio, the profit margin will be insane." She was talking about our home, the place where I had nursed our mother, the place where every floorboard held a memory, as if it were nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet. I said nothing. I walked to my car in a profound daze, the world muted and distant. But as Chloe's voice faded behind me, a different memory surfaced, a secret I had shared only with Mom a year prior. A secret I kept to shield her from one final stress. It was the memory of a strange, faint scratching sound in the walls, a fine, sawdust-like powder along the baseboards in the basement, and the grim-faced pest inspector who had shone a flashlight into the dark, damp crawlspace. He had shown me the crumbling support beams, the intricate, terrifying tunnels carved through the very bones of the house. He had handed me a quote on a clipboard, a number so staggering it had felt like a physical blow, nearly $100,000. A silent, voracious infestation was devouring our home from the inside out. And in that moment, standing on the hot asphalt of the lawyer's parking lot, a cold, quiet resolve settled over me. Chloe wanted the house. She could have it, all of it. "TA. The 30 days that followed were a blur of cardboard boxes and hollow echoes. Each object I packed was a testament to a life I had deferred. My old drafting tools, coated in a fine layer of dust, books on urban planning I hadn't opened in a decade, a faded photograph of a woman I had almost married before Mom's needs became all-consuming. I was not just packing up my room, I was excavating the ruins of my own ambition. The house, my prison and my sanctuary, seemed to watch me with a mournful indifference. Chloe, for her part, treated my presence as a temporary inconvenience. She would breeze in with paint swatches and fabric samples, discussing her grand plans with her husband, Mark, on speakerphone, her voice echoing with an unearned authority. "We'll have to tear out all this dated wallpaper, of course," she'd announced to no one in particular, gesturing at the floral print Mom had picked out in the 80s. "And this carpet is a nightmare." She never offered to help me pack, never asked if I needed anything. It was as if I were already a ghost. During one of her whirlwind visits, she found me in the basement, sorting through old photo albums. "Oh, David," she said, her tone a cloying mix of pity and impatience. "Don't you think you should focus on finding a new place? The deadline is approaching." I looked up at her from a picture of us as children, building a lopsided snowman on the front lawn. Her arm was slung around my shoulder, our smiles wide and genuine. A pang of something grief, maybe, for the sister I once had lanced through me. "I'm working on it, Chloe," I said, my voice flat. "It's a lot to get through." She sighed, a sound of manufactured exasperation. "Well, Mark and I are just so excited to get started. The contractor says we can start demolition the day after you're out. We're going to blow out the kitchen wall and put in a massive island. It will completely transform the space." She didn't see the irony. She was talking about transforming a space while I was trying to figure out how to transform my entire life with a pittance from my mother's estate. I thought about the beams beneath her feet, silently turning to dust. I thought about the colony teeming in the darkness, patient and voracious. I could have said something. A part of me, the part that still remembered that little girl from the photograph, wanted to warn her. Felt like a moral precipice. But then I remembered the lawyer's office, the smug glint in her eye, the callous disregard for the decade I had sacrificed. My silence was not just an omission, it was a choice. It was the only power I had left. I packed the last box, taping it shut with a sense of grim finality. I walked through the empty rooms one last time, the floors groaning under my feet. I could almost hear the faint, incessant chewing in the walls, a secret heartbeat counting down to a reckoning. I left my key on the kitchen counter, next to a stack of Chloe's glossy design magazines. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say. I moved into a small, characterless apartment across town, the kind of place with thin walls and a view of a parking lot. It was a jarring transition. The oppressive quiet of my mother's house was replaced by the noise of other people's lives, a baby crying upstairs, a muffled argument next door. For the first time in 10 years, my schedule was my own. There were no medications to dispense, no appointments to keep, no one to check on in the middle of the night. The freedom was terrifying. It was an ocean of time, and I felt as though I had forgotten how to swim. My days were spent in a daze, applying for jobs I felt laughably unqualified for, and trying to reconnect with a world that had moved on without me. The initial reports from the old neighborhood came through a reluctant grapevine. A former neighbor, Mrs. Gable, called me under the guise of checking in. Her voice was laced with a gossipy curiosity. "Oh, David, dear, there's so much activity at your mother's house. Chloe has a huge dumpster in the driveway. And the noise, it starts at 7 in the morning." I imagined the sounds, the percussive bang of hammers, the high-pitched whine of saws, as a prelude to the main performance. Chloe, I knew, would be orchestrating it all with the self-assured air of a seasoned developer, a role she had cast for herself. She sent me a text message a week after I moved out. It wasn't an inquiry about my well-being. It was a picture of a sledgehammer smashing through the kitchen drywall. The caption read, "Out with the old, in with the new, big things happening." Sparkles, I stared at the image, a knot tightening in my stomach. It was a mix of dread and a dark, thrilling anticipation. I was a spectator at my own revenge play, waiting in the wings for the inevitable climax. Another week passed. I started a temp job doing data entry, a mind-numbing task that mercifully kept my thoughts from spiraling. The pay was meager, but it was a start, a small step back toward a life I could call my own. Then on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Chloe. I let it go to voicemail. My heart was pounding. A minute later, a text popped up. David, call me, it's an emergency. The word emergency felt different coming from her. Chloe's emergencies usually involved a broken nail or a delayed flight. This felt heavier. I took a deep breath and waited. The phone rang again, insistent. This time I answered. What's wrong, Chloe? Her voice was thin, reedy, stripped of its usual confidence. They found something. Who found what? I asked, keeping my tone level. The contractors in the basement. They were checking the support structures before taking down the wall. There was a long pause. I could hear her ragged breathing. David, the main support beam, it's like sawdust. The contractor touched it and it just crumbled. He says the whole foundation is compromised. I remained silent, letting the weight of her words fill the space between us. I wanted her to feel the full, crushing gravity of the situation without any help from me. He brought in a specialist, she continued, her voice rising in panic. A pest inspector. He says it's an advanced subterranean termite infestation, one of the worst he's ever seen. He said it's been active for years. I could almost picture the scene. Chloe, in her designer jeans and pristine white sneakers, standing in the musty basement, her dreams of Italian marble countertops and profit margins dissolving into a pile of wood dust and insect carcasses. The schadenfreude I expected to feel was absent. In its place was a strange, hollow emptiness. This was the moment I had waited for, and yet it brought no joy. He gave me an estimate, David, she whispered, her voice cracking. To tent the house, treat the infestation, and replace the structural beams, he said it could be close to $100,000. There it was, the number that had haunted my sleep for a year, now a bomb detonated in the middle of my sister's life. I don't have that kind of money, she sobbed, the dam of her composure finally breaking. The renovation has already maxed out our credit. The bank won't extend the loan, not for this. We're ruined. Mark is losing his mind. I listened to her cry, the sound tinny and distant through the phone. I thought of all the times I had called her, desperate for a weekend of respite, only to be met with a litany of excuses. I thought of the decade of my life I had given, a gift she had not only failed to acknowledge but had actively conspired to devalue. My silence had been my shield, now it was my sword, and it was time to let it fall. Did you know? Chloe's voice cut through her sobs, sharp with accusation. The question hung in the air, thick and heavy. I had a choice. I could lie, feign surprise, and offer useless sympathy, or I could tell the truth. For 10 years, I had swallowed my own needs, my own voice, for the sake of peace, for the sake of my mother. I was done with silence. Yes, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. I could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. You knew. She stammered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. You knew the house was being eaten alive and you said nothing. I found out about a year ago, I explained, my tone dispassionate, almost clinical. Mom was still with us. Her health was fragile. The inspector gave me the estimate and I made a decision. I decided that the news of her home, her sanctuary, falling apart around her would be a cruelty she didn't need in her final months, so I kept it to myself. I kept it quiet to protect her. To protect her, Chloe shrieked, her grief instantly curdling into rage. Or to screw me over, you let me walk right into this. You watched me pour my savings into a renovation for a house that's practically condemned. This is sick, David. This is twisted. I let her rant, her accusations washing over me. In a way, she was right. My initial motive had been to protect our mother, but my continued silence after the will reading had been for me. It was a passive act of rebellion, the only one available to me. You were so excited about the profit margin, I said calmly. You were talking about flipping the house before we had even left the lawyer's parking lot. It didn't seem like my place to interfere with your business plans. Business plans? This was supposed to be my home, our family home, she cried. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. It stopped being a family home when you had Mom write me out of it, Chloe. It became a real estate transaction, and in any transaction the principle is caveat emptor, buyer beware. A choked, guttural sound came from her end of the line. I can't afford this. I can't afford to fix it, and I can't sell it. Nobody will buy a house with this kind of structural damage. What am I supposed to do? And then came the question. I knew was coming, the one this entire conversation had been building toward. You have to help me, she pleaded, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Mom left you some money. You have to give it to me, to help fix the house. I almost laughed. The token sum I'd been given wouldn't even cover the cost of the fumigation, let alone the foundational reconstruction. She had inherited an estate worth hundreds of thousands, or so she thought, and was now begging me for the crumbs she and our mother had deemed sufficient for my decade of service. No, I said. The word was liberating. For years, no had been a foreign word in my vocabulary. No, I can't meet you for a drink, I have to be with Mom. No, I can't take that job, it's too far away. No, Chloe, I don't need a break, I'm fine. Now the word felt like a key turning in a long rusted lock. What do you mean no? She sputtered. I'm your sister, this is our mother's legacy. Our mother's legacy is a house you manipulated her into giving you, I retorted, a decade of resentment finally surfacing. You inherited the asset, Chloe. That means you also inherit the liability. You got the house, so you get its problems too. I wish you the best of luck with it. I didn't wait for a reply. I ended the call, my hands steady. My heart was a cold, hard knot in my chest. There was no triumph, no elation. Just the quiet, grim satisfaction of a debt finally being paid. The house of cards my sister had built on a foundation of greed was collapsing, and it was doing so on a foundation of sawdust. The aftermath of that phone call was not a sudden, dramatic explosion, but a slow, messy collapse. Chloe didn't call back immediately. I imagined she was too busy cycling through the stages of grief and fury, likely with her husband Mark fanning the flames. The news, however, began to trickle out through the tangled network of our extended family. Our Aunt Carol was the first to call me. She was my mother's older sister, a woman who valued appearances above all else. David, I just spoke with Chloe, she began, her voice dripping with disappointed sympathy. She's absolutely distraught. She told me this dreadful story about the house, and she said you knew about it all along. That's true, I confirmed, offering no further explanation. Well, Aunt Carol huffed, taken aback by my lack of defensiveness. I must say that seems terribly unkind. To let your own sister walk into financial ruin. She could lose everything. Family is supposed to help each other. I helped Mom for 10 years, Aunt Carol. Where was Chloe's help then? The question was met with a flustered silence. Aunt Carol had never once offered to relieve me for a weekend. Her support had been limited to sending sympathy cards with glitter on them. That was different, she finally managed. Your mother was ill. This is a financial matter. It's the same thing, I said, my voice hardening. It's about responsibility. Chloe took on the responsibility of the house. I'm done taking on responsibility for everyone else. The conversation ended on a cool note, and I knew the family narrative was being written, with me cast as the cold-hearted, vengeful brother. A few cousins sent me sanctimonious texts about forgiveness and letting go of bitterness. They hadn't been there. They hadn't seen my life shrink to the size of a sick room. They hadn't felt the sting of being erased from their own mother's final testament. Their opinions were weightless. Chloe, meanwhile, was desperately trying to salvage her situation. According to Mrs. Gable, who had become my unofficial neighborhood correspondent, different contractors and engineers were seen coming and going from the house. Chloe was clearly shopping for a cheaper diagnosis, a miracle cure that didn't exist. She tried to get a second mortgage to cover the repairs, but no bank would touch the property in its current state. She even tried to sue the original home inspector who had surveyed the property before the will was settled, claiming negligence. But the case was laughed out of the lawyer's office. The inspector's report was for the estate, not for her personally, and termites can be notoriously difficult to detect without invasive measures. Her grand renovation project had stalled completely. The dumpster remained in the driveway, a monument to her hubris, slowly filling with rainwater and dead leaves. The sledge-hammered walls of the kitchen were now covered in plastic sheeting, a scar that wouldn't heal. From a distance, I watched her dream turn into a nightmare. She and Mark were forced to put their own home on the market to try and generate the capital for the repairs, but it was a buyer's market, and they were desperate. The stress began to publicly fracture their marriage. Neighbors reported hearing them shouting at each other in the front yard, their arguments echoing down the quiet suburban street. Mark, who had been so eager to count the profits, was apparently furious at being shackled to a money pit. The smug power couple was unraveling, and the house on Oak Street was the catalyst, a silent, rotting witness to their downfall. I felt a grim sense of justice, but it was tainted with a profound sadness. This wasn't just about Chloe. It was about the destruction of our family, the poisoning of our shared history. The house itself, the vessel of our childhood, was sick, and its sickness was a metaphor for our own. One evening, about a month after my final conversation with Chloe, I received an unexpected visitor. It was my cousin, Leo. He was a few years older than me, a quiet, reasonable man who worked as a high school history teacher. Unlike the rest of the family, he had remained silent throughout the ordeal. He stood at the door of my small apartment, looking uncomfortable. "Hey, David," he said. "Can I come in for a minute?" I stepped aside, gesturing to the only comfortable chair in my sparsely furnished living room. "I'm not here to pick a side," he began, sitting down and looking around the room. I wanted to understand." I appreciated his directness. I told him everything. I didn't embellish or editorialize. I just laid out the facts. The 10 years of caregiving, Chloe's rare appearances and manipulative whispers, the shock of the will, the discovery of the termites, and my decision to remain silent. I spoke about the exhaustion, the loneliness, and the deep, abiding sense of betrayal. Leo listened patiently, his expression thoughtful. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I remember visiting your mom a few years back," he finally said. "You were there, of course. You looked exhausted. And she said something strange. She said Chloe was worried about you, that you didn't have any ambition, that you'd never be able to stand on your own 2 feet. It sounded like she was reciting something she'd been told, not something she actually believed. Now it makes sense. His words were a small but powerful validation. It wasn't just my imagination. Chloe's campaign had been real and insidious. "Aunt Carol and the others are giving you a hard time," Leo continued. "They only see the end result. They see a sister in trouble and a brother who won't help. They don't see the decade that led up to it." "I don't expect them to," I said. Then he leaned forward, his expression serious. "Chloe is in a bad way, David. Really bad. Mark left her. He packed a bag last week and moved out. She's alone in that half-demolished house, getting foreclosure notices from the bank. She's talking about declaring bankruptcy. She's broken." He was testing me. He was delivering the bad news and watching for my reaction, looking for a flicker of pity, a crack in my resolve. And he found one. For a moment, I saw her not as the smug architect of my dispossession, but as my little sister, the one I used to push on the swings, the one who used to follow me around like a shadow. The image of her, alone in that rotting, broken house, was a miserable one. A wave of guilt washed over me. Had I gone too far? Was my silence an act of justice or simply one of cruelty? "What do you want me to do, Leo?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said gently. "I'm not asking you to give her money or fix her problems. God knows you've done enough of that. I just think maybe you should think about what comes next. For you, holding on to this anger, this need for her to suffer, it's like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. She's living with the consequences of her actions. Maybe it's time for you to start living with the freedom of yours." He stood up to leave. "For what it's worth," he said at the door, "I don't think you were wrong. I just don't want to see this destroy you too." After he left, I sat in the silence of my apartment for hours, his words echoing in my mind. He was right. The revenge was complete. Chloe's life was in ruins, but I didn't feel free. I felt chained to the satisfaction of her failure, a victory that tasted like ash. My justice had come at the cost of my own peace. The days that followed my conversation with Leo were filled with a restless introspection. I found myself driving past the old house on my way home from work. It was a compulsion, a need to see the physical manifestation of the drama that had consumed our lives. The property was a sad sight. The lawn was overgrown, the once-proud oak tree in the front yard seemed to droop, and a large, bright orange, notice of foreclosure, was taped to the front door. The half-finished renovation was frozen in time, a testament to a dream that had died a violent death. Chloe's car was gone. The house was empty. It was finally truly over. I learned from Mrs. Gable that Chloe had moved back to her home state, her tail between her legs. The bank had repossessed the property on Oak Street. Mark had filed for divorce. Her life been completely dismantled. Seeing the foreclosure notice, I didn't feel the surge of victory I might have a few months prior. I just felt an immense, hollow sadness. The house, our home, was just a casualty now, a property in a bank's portfolio, its history and memories stripped away and reduced to a line on a ledger. It would likely be sold at auction for a fraction of its potential value, probably to a developer who would tear it down and build something new and soulless in its place. The legacy our mother had tried to preserve, however misguidedly, was gone forever. It was in that moment that I finally understood what Leo meant. My anger had been a shield, protecting me from the pain of my mother's betrayal and my sister's greed. But shields are heavy. You can't move forward while holding one up. I decided to write Chloe a letter. Not an apology and not a gloating "I told you so." It was something else. I wrote about our childhood in that house, about the good memories, the ones that predated the sickness and the bitterness. I wrote about how much I had loved our mother and how her illness had changed everything for both of us. I acknowledged the pain her actions had caused me, the profound wound of the will, but I also told her that I was letting it go. I was releasing her from my anger, not for her sake, but for mine. I told her that I hoped, someday, she would find a way to rebuild her life on a better foundation. I didn't know if she would ever read it. I didn't even know her new address, so I sent it to her old one, with a "please forward" written on the envelope. It was a message in a bottle, cast into an ocean of bad blood. Whether it reached her or not didn't matter as much as the act of sending it. It was my own notice of foreclosure, a declaration that I was done living in the wreckage of the past. It was time to start building something new for myself. Life began to assemble itself in small, meaningful ways. The temp data entry job led to a permanent position with a small urban development firm. It wasn't the architectural career I had once dreamed of, but it was a foot back in the door of a world I loved. My boss, a man named Arthur, was a patient mentor who saw the dormant potential under my decade-long resume gap. He gave me small design projects, and with each one, I felt a piece of my old self flicker back to life. I reconnected with old friends, the ones who had drifted away not out of malice, but because my life as a caregiver had been an impenetrable fortress. There were awkward coffees and apologetic conversations, but true friendships proved resilient. They had known me before I was just a leaner's son, and they helped me remember that person, too. The small, anonymous apartment started to feel like a home. I filled it with plants, with books, with the smell of my own cooking. The sounds of my neighbors became a comforting hum rather than an intrusion. It was a life built from scratch, humble and quiet, but it was mine. I never heard back from Chloe directly. The letter was never returned to sender, so I could only assume she received it. About a year later, however, Leo called me. "I thought you might want to know," he said. "I heard through the grapevine that Chloe is working again. She's a receptionist at a dental office. She's living in a small apartment, kind of like yours." He paused. "I also heard she's in therapy, trying to figure things out." I processed the information. There was no joy in her diminished circumstances, but there was a sense of balance, of a necessary recalibration. She was starting over just as I had. Her journey would be different, colored by her own choices and their consequences, but it was a start. "That's good to hear," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. "I'm glad she's getting help." Our conversation drifted to other things, and the subject of my sister was closed. She was no longer a central figure in my life, no longer an antagonist in my story. She was just a person, flawed and broken, trying to find her way far from me. One Saturday, I drove past Oak Street one last time. The old house was gone. In its place stood a vacant lot, scraped clean and covered in straw. A large sign was hammered into the dirt. "Sold. Future home of the Miller family." A new house would be built. A new family would make new memories. Our history there had been razed, but the land remained, ready for a fresh start. And as I looked at that empty space, I didn't feel sadness or anger. I felt peace. The ghosts were gone. The bitterness had finally leached out of my soul, like poison from the soil. My revenge had been to let the truth come to light. But my recovery, my true empowerment, came from choosing to walk away from the rubble and build my own foundation, one that was strong, sound, and entirely my own. My work at the development firm became more than just a job. It was a form of therapy. I threw myself into projects, focusing on community-oriented designs, parks, libraries, affordable housing. I found a deep satisfaction in creating spaces that brought people together, that fostered a sense of stability and belonging. It was the antithesis of the house on Oak Street, a place that had become a symbol of division and decay. My boss, Arthur, noticed my dedication. He started giving me more responsibility, allowing me to lead client meetings and manage small-scale builds. A part of my brain that had lain dormant for a decade, the part that could see blueprints in empty spaces and visualize the flow of human life through a building, was now fully awake and firing on all cylinders. I was no longer just a caregiver or a vengeful brother. I was David, an architectural designer with a future. I even started dating. Her name was Sarah, a landscape architect I met on a collaborative project. She was kind and funny, with a sharp intellect and a gentle spirit. She knew a version of my story, not all the ugly details, but the broad strokes, that I had taken time off to care for my mother and was now rebuilding my career. She never pressed for more information, respecting the quiet boundaries I had built around that part of my life. Being with her was easy. It was a space free from the weight of family history and expectation. Our time together was about the future, planning weekend trips, discussing our professional ambitions, building something new together. She was helping me draft the blueprints for a life I had thought was lost to me forever. The memory of my mother softened over time. The bitterness of her final decision was slowly eroded by the fond memories of the woman she was before the illness. I remembered her teaching me how to ride a bike, her patience as I wobbled and fell. I remembered her pride at my high school graduation, her belief in my talent. I realized that the woman who signed that will was not the mother who had raised me. She was a woman in pain, susceptible to the whispers of a daughter who preyed on her fears. Forgiving her felt less like an absolution for her and more like a final act of liberation for me. I chose to remember the mother I loved, not the one who had wounded me. My relationship with my extended family remained distant, but the animosity faded into a kind of neutral, polite space. We saw each other at the occasional wedding or funeral. We would nod, exchange pleasantries about the weather and our jobs, and move on. They saw that I was happy, that I was thriving, and it left little room for their judgment. I had built a life that needed no defense. The story of what happened with Chloe and the house became a kind of local family legend, a cautionary tale whispered at holiday gatherings. But for me, it was no longer a source of pain. It was just a story about a different man, a person I used to be, whose life had been defined by a crumbling house. Years passed. My career flourished. Sarah and I moved in together, our shared space a testament to our combined aesthetics, my clean, modern lines and her lush, organic textures. We built a life filled with quiet joy, mutual respect, and a shared vision for the future. The house on Oak Street was a distant memory, a chapter from a book I had long since finished reading. Then, one day, an envelope arrived in the mail. It had no return address, but I recognized the looping, slightly dramatic handwriting immediately. It was from Chloe. My hand trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter written on simple stationery. "David," it began. "I don't know if you'll read this. I don't deserve for you to. I'm writing this because my therapist said it's a necessary step, but for the first time it feels like something I actually want to do. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Those words are so small and they can't fix anything, but I need to say them. I was greedy and I was cruel. I was so insecure, so terrified that my life looked like a failure next to your sacrifice that I had to tear you down to feel like I was worth something. I poisoned Mom's mind against you because I was a coward. I know that now. What you did, letting me discover the truth on my own, was a hard lesson. It cost me everything. My marriage, my home, my financial stability. For a long time, I hated you for it. I saw you as a monster. But the truth is, you just held up a mirror. You forced me to see the person I had become. It was the hardest and most important lesson of my life. I've spent the last few years trying to rebuild. It's slow and it's hard, but I'm doing it. I hope you're happy. I hope you've built the life you were supposed to have before you had to put it all on hold for Mom. You deserve it. Chloe." I read the letter twice, the words sinking in. There was no request for forgiveness, no plea for reconciliation. It was a simple, stark confession. It was an acknowledgement of the truth. A weight I didn't even realize I was still carrying lifted from my shoulders. It was the now quiet click of a lock I had been trying to open for years. Sarah found me sitting in the living room holding the letter. "What is it?" she asked gently, sitting beside me. I handed it to her. She read it, her expression softening. "Wow," she whispered. "That must have taken a lot for her to write." "Yeah," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was more like closure, a sense of peace. The story finally had an ending. It wasn't about a crumbling house or a vengeful victory anymore. It was about two broken people finding their separate paths to rebuilding on solid ground. That evening, I walked out onto the balcony of our apartment, looking out at the city lights. I had spent a decade of my life in a house that was slowly being devoured from the inside, a perfect metaphor for the family it contained. Now, I was finally in a home I had helped build, a structure based on love, trust, and truth. The past was a ghost, but it no longer had the power to haunt me. I was free. The following morning, I took Chloe's letter and placed it in a small wooden box where I kept a few important mementos. My father's old watch, a photograph of my mother before she got sick, my first architectural award from the firm. It felt right to put it there, not as a trophy of my victory, but as a reminder of the entire journey. It was a testament to the fact that even the most painful endings can lead to new and better beginnings. Life settled into a comfortable, fulfilling rhythm. Sarah and I eventually married in a small ceremony in a botanical garden she had helped design. Leo was there, my only family representative, and he gave a toast that was both funny and deeply moving, speaking of resilience and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild. He never mentioned Chloe, but we both knew her story was an unspoken part of mine. We decided against having children of our own, pouring our creative and nurturing energies into our work, our community, and our wide circle of friends. Our home became a hub for gatherings, filled with laughter and intelligent conversation, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of my former life. I occasionally thought about Chloe. I hoped her letter was a true reflection of her new path. I hoped she had found some measure of peace, that she was building a life, however small, that was honest and self-reliant. I harbored no desire to see her or speak to her again. Our shared history was too fraught, the wound too deep to ever fully disappear. The closure she had given me was enough. Our paths had diverged permanently, and that was for the best. One afternoon, while reviewing blueprints for a new low-income housing project, I found myself sketching on a piece of scratch paper. I drew the floor plan of the house on Oak Street from memory, the crooked hallway, the sunny breakfast nook, the bedroom where I had spent a decade tending to my mother. I looked at the drawing, a map of my past, and felt no anger, no sadness. Only a distant, detached sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons it had taught me about my own strength, about the corrosive nature of resentment, and about the quiet power of letting go. That house had almost destroyed me. Its hidden decay had been the catalyst for my darkest and most vengeful impulses. But it had also, in its own way, set me free. It had forced me out of a life of sacrificial stagnation and propelled me into a future I had to build for myself. I crumpled up the piece of paper and tossed it into the recycling bin. I had other blueprints to focus on, other structures to build. The past was a foundation, flawed, compromised, and ultimately demolished. But it was the ground upon which I had built a much stronger, more beautiful life. The silence I now cherished was not one of absence and unspoken grief, but one of peace and contentment, the quiet hum of a life well lived and hard won. The most profound justice, I had learned, wasn't about watching someone else fall. It was about having the strength to build yourself back up, stronger than before. My journey taught me that true empowerment isn't found in the grand, dramatic acts of revenge, but in the quiet, steady work of rebuilding one's own life on a foundation of self-worth and integrity. The satisfaction of seeing someone get what they deserve is fleeting, but the peace that comes from healing your own wounds and creating a future you are proud of is enduring. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from the ruins and refuse to let the bitterness of the past poison the potential of your future. Justice is not always about leveling the scales. Often, it's about building your own, new set of scales and weighing your life with grace, forgiveness for yourself, and the freedom to move forward. The ultimate victory lies not in the other person's defeat, but in your own triumphant, peaceful survival. I found my success not in the rubble of my sister's life, but in the blueprints of my own. I became the architect of my own happiness, and that was a home no one could ever take from me. The years continued to be kind. My firm grew, and I eventually became a partner, shaping the skyline of the city in small but meaningful ways. Sarah and I traveled, we learned, we grew old together, our love a quiet, steady thing. The drama of my early life became a story I sometimes told, a cautionary tale about the complexities of family and the importance of boundaries. The sharp edges of the memory had long since worn smooth, leaving behind not a wound, but a scar, a reminder of a battle fought and won, not against my sister, but against the bitterness that had threatened to consume me. Chloe's name faded from my life almost completely. The last I heard, through a distant family rumor, was that she had moved to a different part of the country and remarried. I felt a flicker of something, not happiness, not sadness, just a neutral acceptance. Her story was her own to write, just as mine was my own. We were strangers now, bound only by a shared, traumatic past that we had both, in our own ways, survived. The empty lot on Oak Street now hosted a large, modern home, full of light and the sounds of a young family. I drove by it once, years later, out of simple curiosity. I felt no connection to the land, no ghostly echo of what had been. It was just a place. My home was with Sarah. My legacy was in the buildings I designed and the quiet, happy life I had constructed from the ashes of my old one. My mother's will had intended to leave me with nothing but a pittance and an eviction notice. But in the end, it had given me the greatest inheritance of all, the opportunity to discover who I was without the weight of that house, that family, that obligation. I had lost a home, but I had found myself. And that was a trade I would make again, in a heartbeat. The final lesson was the simplest. The foundations that matter most are not made of wood and concrete, but of character, resilience, and the unwavering belief that you are worthy of building a life on your own terms. The story of my past became a cornerstone of my character, not a millstone around my neck. In my work, I found I had a unique empathy for projects that involved reclamation, turning old, neglected buildings into vibrant community centers, or designing parks on formerly industrial land. I understood, on a visceral level, that a rotten foundation didn't always mean the end. Sometimes, it was an opportunity to clear the slate and build something better, something stronger. This perspective made me a better designer, and I think, a better man. Sarah often said that my past had given me a kind of quiet strength, an unflappable calm in the face of chaos. When projects went wrong or clients became difficult, I had a deep well of patience to draw from. I had already faced the collapse of my entire world, a delayed shipment of building materials hardly registered as a crisis. This resilience became my superpower. It was the unexpected gift born from a decade of hardship and a profound betrayal. I never tried to hide my past, but I didn't lead with it either. It was simply a part of the complex architecture of my own identity. My relationship with Leo remained the one solid bridge to my family. We would meet for lunch a few times a year, our conversations easy and comfortable. He was the keeper of my history, the one person who had seen the whole picture and had chosen understanding over judgment. Through him, I learned to see my family not as a monolithic entity of betrayal, but as a collection of flawed individuals, each acting out of their own fears and insecurities. It was a more compassionate, if still distant, view. One day, Leo mentioned that Aunt Carol was in a nursing home, her memory fading. He told me that she sometimes asked about me, confusing me with my father, remembering me only as a kind young boy. There was a strange, bittersweet poetry in that. In the fog of her dementia, she had forgotten the judgment and the drama, leaving only the memory of a simpler, kinder time. It was a reminder that time, in its relentless march, eventually sands down all the sharp edges, leaving only the barest outlines of what once was. My life with Sarah was my sanctuary. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. We were a team, in our work and in our life. The stability and love she provided were the bedrock upon which I had been able to fully rebuild myself. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the greatest act of defiance against a painful past is to build a joyful present. The story could have ended with me as a bitter, lonely man, savoring a cold and empty victory. But I had chosen a different path. I had chosen to invest in my own future rather than dwelling on the ruins of someone else's. The termites had destroyed a house, but they had not destroyed me. My sister's greed had cost her everything. But it had inadvertently given me my freedom. Life's greatest ironies are often its most profound lessons. My name is David, and I am an architect, not just of buildings, but of my own life. I learned that the best revenge is not a dish served cold, but a life lived warmly, fully, and without regret. I cleared the rot from my life, tore down the structures that were holding me back, and built a future on a foundation of my own making. And it is a beautiful, unshakable home. The years mellowed me, as they do all men who pay attention. The quiet satisfaction I felt about my life was no longer defined in opposition to my past, but as a thing that existed on its own terms. The story of the house, of Chloe, of the termites, became less of a defining trauma and more of an origin story, the cataclysm that had forced a profound and necessary evolution. It was the fire that had forged the steel. I found that I could talk about it without the old, familiar knot of anger tightening in my chest. It had become a narrative, and I was no longer trapped inside it. I was its narrator, able to look back with the clarity and compassion that only distance can provide. Sarah and I eventually retired, selling our city apartment and moving to a small house on the coast that we designed together. It was a simple structure, all glass and cedar, with a clear view of the ocean. It was the physical manifestation of our life together, open, honest, and built to withstand the storms. Our days were filled with simple pleasures, long walks on the beach, gardening, reading, and the company of good friends. It was a peaceful epilogue to a life that had begun with so much turmoil. One day, a letter arrived, forwarded from my old firm. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky. It was from a woman who introduced herself as Chloe's daughter, my niece. I hadn't even known she had a child. She wrote that Chloe had passed away a week prior from a sudden illness. She said she had found my letter, the one I had written all those years ago, tucked away in her mother's bedside table. She read it often, my niece wrote. I think it was both a punishment and a comfort to her. She told me the whole story once. She didn't spare herself. She wanted me to know the mistakes she had made. She was not a perfect woman, but in the last years of her life, she tried hard to be a good one. She was sober, she worked hard, and she was a wonderful mother to me. I know it's not my place to ask, but I hope you can know that she found some redemption. She was very proud of the man you became. Attached to the letter was a recent photograph. It showed a woman who looked vaguely like the sister I remembered, but older, her face softer, her eyes holding a weary kindness I had never seen before. She was standing with a young girl, both of them smiling. I showed the letter and the photo to Sarah. It seems she finally rebuilt too, Sarah said softly. I nodded, a complex wave of emotions washing over me. Grief for the sister I had lost twice, once to greed and now to time. Sadness for all the wasted years, but also a profound sense of peace. The story was truly, finally complete. The house on Oak Street was long gone. My mother and sister were gone. The anger and resentment were gone. All that was left was the life I had built, the love I shared with my wife, and the quiet wisdom that comes from surviving the wreckage of the past. The ocean breeze blew through the open window, and I felt not a sense of victory, but one of deep, abiding gratitude for the long, crooked, and ultimately rewarding path that had led me home.